subject of tonight's webinar, it's titled, "Is My Airplane Too Broken to Fly?" And we're going to be talking about the regulations that govern when you can fly and when you can't fly if you have inoperative instruments or equipment in your airplane. I'd love to see a show of hands. We didn't set up a survey of how many of you have squawk-free airplanes, but I certainly can tell you that mine isn't a squawk-free airplane. It's a twin, and it has way too many moving parts to be squawk-free at any given point in time. So if you were to climb in my airplane, you would notice that on the instrument panel there is virtually always a post-it note where I keep track of things that aren't working right. And when I notice something new, I add it to the post-it note, and when I get a squawk fixed, I cross it off the post-it note and periodically replace the post-it note with a new one. But there's always a post-it note on my panel that has a list of issues, mechanical issues with the airplane, things that need to be dealt with. And so the question that we're going to be dealing with tonight is, how serious does a squawk need to be in order to render an airplane too broken to fly? In other words, when are we allowed to fly our airplanes with things that aren't working right? And when are we grounded until we fix those things? You know, the basic regulation, 91.7, says that no person may operate a civil aircraft unless it's in an airworthy condition. I always loved that reg because I assume that means that uncivil aircraft don't need to be airworthy. I guess military aircraft or whatever. But the basic rule is that we're not allowed to fly an airplane unless it's in an airworthy condition. And furthermore, if the airplane becomes unairworthy in flight, it's our obligation to discontinue the flight and put the airplane back on the ground. So, you know, the question is, what exactly makes an aircraft unairworthy and therefore not legal to fly? For example, is it legal to fly with a failed vacuum pump or a burned out nav light? A GPS or a comm radio that's not working, a broken stall warning sensor, a flaky fuel flow gauge, a sticky airspeed indicator, a bad passenger microphone jack, a failed alternator? How do we know what kinds of squawks are legal to fly with and what kinds of squawks are not legal to fly with? And you know, how, as pilot in command, are we supposed to know how to make that sort of airworthiness determination? Well, there are two potential answers to that question. One is you can ask your mechanic, and the other one is that you can consult the regs. And since these sorts of things often come up at times and places where it's not convenient to consult our mechanics, what we're going to talk about tonight is what the regs say, so that we can make these sorts of decisions on our own. Now, the primary regulation that governs operation of an aircraft within inoperative instruments and equipment is 91.213. And we're going to go through and parse it. It's a very long and very complicated reg. And therefore one that's not well understood by a lot of pilots. But we're going to go through and parse this very long and complicated reg and figure out what it says and what it means. And 91.213 starts out with the following verbiage. It says, except as provided in paragraph D, no person may take off an aircraft with inoperative instruments or equipment installed unless the following two conditions are met. First of all, there's an approved minimum equipment list for the aircraft. And second, the aircraft has within it a letter of authorization from the local FSDO authorizing the use of that minimum equipment list. Now, that part of the reg is pretty useless to most of us because hardly any piston GA aircraft have an approved minimum equipment list. Most turbine airplanes do, but very, very few piston GA aircraft have an approved MEL. And in fact, it's almost impossible to get an approval unless you're a Part 135 operator. And most of us operate on Part 91. And if we went to our FSDO and asked to get an approved MEL, most FSDOs would turn us away. So if we don't have an MEL, and most of us don't, then that paragraph D, that exception, is the thing that we have to rely upon. And paragraph D of this regulation is basically the part that was intended for the use of piston GA aircraft and other aircraft that don't have an MEL. As I said, most all turbine airplanes do have an MEL, and most piston airplanes don't. So let's see what paragraph D says, and this is a very shortened version of it. It says a person may take off an aircraft in operations conducted under this part with an operative instruments and equipment without an approved MEL, provided, and then there's 4 subparagraphs. The first one says the flight operation is conducted in a rotorcraft, non-turbine powered airplane, glider, lighter than air aircraft, powered parachute, or weight shift control aircraft. So that covers most of the stuff that we fly down at the bottom of the food chain. And this paragraph D is really intended for us. And then there's 3 more parts of paragraph D, 1, 2, and 3, that we'll go into one by one. But that's basically the structure of paragraph D of 91.2.13. And these are the 3 paragraphs that are at the heart of the matter that we need to understand what they say. So let's take a look at these subparagraphs 2, 3, and 4 and see what they say. Subparagraph 2 says inoperative equipments and instruments and equipment are not one of all of these 4 things. And let's just look at the 4 things. First of all, they can't be part of the VFR day type certification instruments and equipments that were required for all aircraft certified under the regulations under which the aircraft was certified. And for most legacy aircraft, that means CAR3. For more recently certified airplanes like Cirruses and Diamonds and so on, that would be FAR 23. But instruments and equipment that are required by regulation for all aircraft certified under one of these regs have to be working. The second thing says that the inoperative instruments and equipment are not indicated as required equipment on the aircraft's equipment list or required on the kinds of operation equipment list for the kinds of flight being conducted. Now, for legacy CAR3 aircraft like the twin Cessna that I fly, we have an equipment list that's provided with the aircraft by the manufacturer. For newer airplanes certified under Part 23, the aircraft will have what's called a KOEL, a kinds of equipment list, and I'll show you just a quick example of each of those. The one on the left here is an equipment list out of a Cessna 182, which is a legacy aircraft certified under CAR 3. And the thing on the right is a KOEL out of a Cirrus SR-22, which is a Part 23 aircraft. The basic difference is that the equipment list specifies what equipment is required or optional across the board, but a KOEL specifies what's required or not required for different kinds of flights, day VFR, night VFR, day IFR, and night IFR. So it's a little bit more comprehensive. And these KOELs only appear if you have a Part 23 aircraft, which is an aircraft that was certified sometime in say, the last 10 or 15 years. But for aircraft that were certified earlier than that, like the airplane I fly, we don't have a KOEL. We just have an equipment list, and it lists equipment as either required or not required, but it doesn't break it down by what kind of flight you're making. So interestingly enough, in my Cessna 310, I'm not allowed to take off with an inoperative alternator. I have 2 alternators, but both of them are listed as required equipment on the equipment list. And so if I have a bad alternator, I'm not allowed to take off, even though I still have a good one. On the other hand, in the Cirrus SR-22, its KOEL says that it only needs to have both alternators and both batteries if it's flying IFR, and that if it's flying VFR, alternator number 2 and battery number 2 are allowed to be inoperative. Here's what the KOEL looks like out of the manual, and you can see battery number 2 and alternator 2. You're not required to have them for VFR day or VFR night, but you are required to have them for day IFR and night IFR. So the new KOELs that come with the more recently certificated aircraft are kind of a nicer way of doing it, and it gives more flexibility. But for those of us that are flying legacy aircraft that were certified under the old CAR3 regs, we won't have one of these, and we have to rely on just the equipment list. The third part of subparagraph 2 says that the inoperative instruments or equipment are not required by FAR 91205 or any other rule in Part 91. 91205 is the reg, if you'll require, that talks about what kinds of instruments and equipment are required for day VFR, night VFR, and IFR operations. And then other pertinent regulations that bear here would be 91207 that talks about when an ELT is required, 91209 which talks about lighting, and 91211 that talks about when supplemental oxygen are required. So if the equipment is required by any of those 4 regulations, then we're not allowed to fly if the equipment is inoperative. So for example, for VFR flight, we are not required to have an attitude indicator. So our attitude indicator is allowed to be inoperative, and we can still fly VFR, but not IFR. On the other hand, 91205 requires that we have an airspeed indicator and an altimeter for VFR flight. So those are not allowed to be inoperative. And the final item is it's not that the inoperative equipment is not required to be operational by an airworthiness directive. That would be a very, very uncommon thing, would hardly ever apply, but it is part of the reg. Going on to subparagraph 3, it says that the inoperative instruments and equipment are either removed from the aircraft or they are deactivated and placarded inoperative. So if we want to fly with inoperative instruments or equipment, that equipment either needs to be removed from the aircraft or placarded inoperative. Now, if we remove it from the aircraft, if it's tray-mounted avionics, for example, if you have a bad, say, number 2 comm radio, you're allowed to remove that yourself as the owner of the aircraft. It's one of the things that's permissible under an owner's preventive maintenance authority. Similarly, even instruments that slide out from the front, an owner is allowed to remove. But if you have to take screws off and remove it from the back of the panel, then it requires a mechanic to do it. The other option, other besides removing it, is simply deactivating and placarding it in an operative, and that's usually a lot easier to do. So deactivation might just require pulling a circuit breaker and putting a tie wrap around it. Placarding can be done with a Post-it note, so complying with that part of the reg is very easy to do. So, for example, if we had our inoperative attitude indicator, putting a Post-it note over the indicator and writing inop on it would satisfy both requirements of the reg. Putting it the Post-it note over it would disable it, and writing inop on the Post-it note would placard it, and you're good to go VFR, because the attitude indicator is not required to be operational for VFR flight. And finally, and this is sort of the gotcha for the pilot. The pilot has to make a determination, either the pilot or a mechanic needs to make a determination that the inoperative instrument or equipment does not constitute a hazard to the aircraft. So the FAA sort of puts the burden on us that if we fly with inoperative equipment and then we get in trouble because the equipment is inoperative, it's on our head. Now, you don't have to actually write down your non-hazard determination anywhere, but if you get in trouble and it turns out that you got in trouble because you flew with inoperative equipment, you may have some explaining to do with the FAA as to why you decided that it was not a hazard to fly with that inoperative equipment. So we have that burden. So the bottom line is you're allowed to fly with inoperative instruments and equipment if that equipment is not explicitly required by certification, the equipment list, or those Part 91 regulations that we talked about, 205, 207, et cetera. That the inoperative equipment is either removed or it's disabled. Disabling it is usually easy. And placarded as inoperative, which just means writing something on a Post-it note and putting it on the instrument panel. And you have determined that the inoperative equipment does not constitute a hazard, and you as the pilot in command are allowed to make that determination. So that's basically the rules of the road and on this subject. And Tim, that's all the prepared stuff that I had, so we can open it up for some Q&A.
Great.
I told you it was going to be short tonight.
Short and sweet. I love it when regulatory subjects like this are short and sweet. That's kind of nice. Good job. Okay, let's get into some questions here. We did get a few come in, and we had a few folks kind of wondering how this is applicable to experimental aircraft. Would you care to comment on experimental aircraft?
Well, a lot of it is applicable to experimental aircraft because, after all, Part 91 applies to experimental aircraft just as it does to certificated aircraft. Some of the stuff doesn't really apply. You know, it's very unlikely that there would be an airworthiness directive in an experimental aircraft. We don't really have a manufacturer-supplied equipment list, so we don't have equipment that is required or optional, and we certainly don't have a KOEL. So some of the stuff that would affect a certificated aircraft isn't present for an experimental aircraft, so you have more flexibility. But the basic rules of the road apply. I mean, for example, 91205 says that you need to have an altimeter and an airspeed indicator for VFR flight, and presumably that regulation would apply to any kind of aircraft, whether it's certificated or not.
Well, for experimental aircraft, I'll just jump in there. For experimental aircraft, we get a pass on that one if we're just operating daytime VFR. 91205 is not applicable. It's only applicable for experimental aircraft if we're going to operate night or IFR. So that is a little different.
Yeah,
So
Tim,
we can.
you have to educate me on this because, as you know, all my experiences with certificated aircraft. But where in the regulations does it say that? I'm kind of curious.
It doesn't.
Where would
It isn't in the regulation. It's in the operating limitations issued to the aircraft when the FAA issues the airworthiness certificate. And in the operating limitations, it makes 91.205 applicable. Because 91.205 itself only applies to aircraft with standard category aircraft.
Okay, well, you just give me a homework
applicable
assignment because I need to look up the reg. I wasn't aware that 91.205 said anything about it being applicable only to normal category aircraft, but I'll need to.
Yeah,
maybe you and I need to have a conversation offline about that because I need to understand more about how that could work.
Sure, sure.
Part 91 is basically rules for operating in the airspace, and you know, there are some regulations like Part 43 that explicitly say this doesn't apply to experimental aircraft, but Part 91 doesn't say that. So I need to understand how
Yep.
experimental aircraft could get a pass on the requirements of Part 91.
Okay, homework assignment for Mike.
Absolutely. maybe for the two of us.
Okay, so let's see here. Question from Robert. In this cold weather, I notice a cold breeze coming in somewhere on the door of my Cessna 152. What's the easiest way to find the location of the leak, and should I take the door off to install replacement door gaskets?
That doesn't seem to have anything to do with what we're talking about tonight, but the easiest way to find the location of the leak, in my experience, is to go fly the airplane and put a stethoscope on and run the stethoscope around the perimeter of the door while you're in flight, and you should hear very loudly where it's leaking. If you need to put a new door seal on, in my experience, it's very hard to do that properly without removing the door.
Gotcha.
And on a Cessna 152, it's really easy to remove the door.
Yeah. Okay, Richard wonders if my transponder is not working and I plan to fly to a non-controlled airports under 25 miles from my home airport, is my aircraft safe and legal to fly?
Transponders are not required as a matter of airworthiness. Transponders, an operating transponder is only required to fly in certain designated airspace, and all of the regs that articulate those requirements always start with the wording "unless otherwise authorized by ATC." So you can always fly with an inoperative transponder, even into a Class B airspace, if you call up the ATC facility in advance and get a waiver from them. I remember years ago I had the experience of having to fly an airplane with an inoperative transponder from Dallas, Texas, right into the heart of the LA basin and land at Long Beach, which is a big airline airport. And I made the entire flight with an inoperative transponder. ATC was very generous in waiving the requirement, even though I was going through all sorts of airspace that should have required a transponder. So ATC is usually very cooperative about that sort of thing. But if you're going to fly the airplane through airspace where a transponder is required, which would mean any place within the 30-mile circle around Class B, anything above 10,000 feet, and anything inside of Class D airspace, or Class C airspace rather. Then you need to get a waiver from ATC. You can do that simply by calling them on the phone or calling them on the radio in advance of entering the airspace. And normally they're very cooperative about letting you do that. You do need special permission. If you're flying the airplane in airspace where a transponder is not required, which it sounds like was the basis of the question that was posed, then you don't need to talk to anybody. Just do it.
Great. Okay, same scenario except ELT instead of transponder. So flying within 25 miles of the home base and to non-controlled airports, ELT isn't working. Is that okay?
Well, you know, the ELT reg, which I guess is what, 91207, does have a waiver for local flights that it's not required, but it doesn't have a waiver where you can call ATC or anybody and get permission to fly outside of that area without an operating ELT. So for I don't have the reg in front of me, but for local flights, the reg explicitly permits operation without an operating ELT. But for flights, for cross-country flights, the ELT is required, and I don't know of any way of getting a waiver for that.
Okay. John asks, could we take off if the flaps are inoperative under CAR 23 and FAR 91.213? They are part of the TDC, Type Data Certificate, I assume he means. I don't know, he said CAR 23, he might have meant FAR 23 maybe, huh?
Yeah. I think that technically you would not be allowed to take off with inoperative wing flaps without a ferry permit. I mean, personally, I wouldn't have a problem doing so because, you know, we know that the airplane can safely take off and land flaps up, if assuming that there's enough runway. But I think technically you would have to have a ferry permit in order to take off with known inoperative wing flaps. The way we usually handle that is, you know, when we have a client in a situation like this, and getting a ferry permit would be inconvenient or delay things inordinately. We say, look, if anybody asks you, just say that they were working when you took off, and when you got to your destination, you put them down, and they didn't go down. But you know, and if anybody quotes me, I'll deny it. No, wait a minute, this is going to be on a video, isn't it?
Uh-oh.
The statute of limitations has run. But in any case, I think technically, in order, if you have known inoperative wing flaps, I think you would need a ferry permit. Now, the ferry permit would take you about 15 seconds to get. All you need to do is call up the FSDO, explain the situation, and they would fax you back a ferry permit, you know, probably within 30 minutes.
Okay.
So it wouldn't be a big deal unless you need to do it on a Sunday or something when the FSDO is closed, and that's when you might want to think about using Plan B.
All right. All right. Lester's wondering, can you fly VFR if your battery or alternator 2 are okay, but battery or alternator 1 are inop, respectively?
Was he speaking specifically about the Cirrus?
He didn't say anything if it was a Cirrus or not, but.
Well, I mean, he's obviously talking about an airplane that's either a Cirrus or like a Cirrus with a fully redundant electrical system with 2 batteries and 2 alternators. In the case of the Cirrus, the KOEL is very explicit that alternator 1 and battery 1 need to be working for all operations, and battery 2 and alternator 2 are only required for IFR. Now these are the older Cirruses where the electrical system is very asymmetrical. The alternator 2 is a small standby alternator with a, I don't know, a 25 amp capacity, something quite small. And battery 2 is a couple of motorcycle gel cells that are usable to power avionics and stuff, but are not capable of, for example, starting the engine. The later Cirruses have a more symmetrical system where both alternators are put out a lot of current, and both batteries are the same kind of batteries. And I actually don't have a KOEL for one of the later Cirruses at my fingertips to check, but it might be with that kind of a symmetrical electrical system that they would allow either one to be inoperative. I'm not sure. I'd have to check that. For the earlier Cirruses, where the battery number 2 and the alternator number 2 are small, basically backup systems with low current, a low current alternator and a low ampere hour battery. The requirement is that the number 1s have to be working for all operations. The number 2s only have to be working for IFR.
Okay, great. And refresh me, KOEL stands for what?
Kinds of operation list.
Okay.
And it's that newer kind of equipment list that are in Part 23 POHs that have columns for day VFR, night VFR, day IFR, night IFR, and indicate what equipment has to be operational for each of those things.
Great, thanks. Nick's wondering if an aircraft has a MEL, such as my Cessna 340, does that mean that paragraph D is not applicable to us? Now, which paragraph, which regulation paragraph D he didn't stay? Maybe you can figure that out.
Paragraph D in its entirety is not applicable to an aircraft that has an approved MEL aboard. That is, it has an FAA-issued MEL, and it has a letter from the FSDO authorizing the use of that MEL.
Oh, that's an easy answer. Great.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the very beginning of that, paragraph D talks specifically about an aircraft without an approved minimum equipment list. So if the airplane has an approved minimum equipment list, paragraph D does not apply.
Great. Good answer.
Okay.
Tom just simply asked, can a pilot remove a transponder?
Technically, no. If you look in Part 43, Appendix A sub C, which is where it lists all of the preventive maintenance operations that an owner pilot is allowed to do without involvement of a mechanic, it specifically says that tray-mounted avionics may be removed except for pulse equipment, which is generally interpreted as being transponders and DMEs. Now, I'm not really sure why the thing is written that way, and I personally wouldn't have any heartache over a pilot pulling a KT-76A out of the panel, but technically the transponder is supposed to be removed by a mechanic, but a comm radio or a GPS or anything like that is allowed to be removed by an aircraft owner.
Okay.
Again, some of these things with respect to what is permitted as preventive maintenance and what isn't are very, very peculiar, and in many cases don't make a lot of sense. And this is one of the ones that has always puzzled me, why they would exclude pulse equipment. But technically, I believe the answer is that the pilot is not officially allowed to pull a transponder.
Okay. John asks, would taking off in a single-engine aircraft where the engine is making flakes of metal the size of a fingernail shavings be acceptable?
Well, that's an interesting question. If it is a Lycoming engine, then there's actually an official answer from Lycoming. I actually have a webinar in the series that's on the EAA video server that's basically on the subject of how my engine is making metal, I think is the title of it, that actually walks through the Lycoming guidance and indicates exactly what you're allowed to fly with and what you're not allowed to fly with. For Continental engines, Continental has never provided any guidance on that subject. Actually, despite my pleas to them to come out with a service bulletin similar to the one that Lycoming has had out for a long time. So there's no official guidance for Continental engines. Of course, even the Lycoming guidance is a service bulletin, and so it doesn't really have any regulatory impact. But obviously, one of the things that that 91.213 requires is that you make a determination that the thing is not hazardous. And if you had a Lycoming engine and you used the Lycoming service bulletin as your guide as to whether this was hazardous or not, I think you'd be on very firm footing. You know, as I said, if you take off with inoperative equipment and then something bad happens, you may have to explain to the FAA how you made a determination that it was non-hazardous to do that. An engine that's making metal is not exactly inoperative, so it's a bit of a stretch to apply this reg to it. But again, in the case of a Lycoming engine, there's official Lycoming guidance as to how much metal constitutes a hazard and should be caused to ground the airplane. And I won't go through the whole song and dance, but basically it says if there are any pieces of metal larger than 1/16 of an inch in diameter, or if there is a bunch of fine pieces of metal that total a quarter of a teaspoon or more, those are the thresholds where they say don't fly the airplane until the source of the metal has been determined.
Good. Donald asks, what about removed equipment? Do you need to make a logbook entry and weight and balance change?
You only would need to make a weight and balance change if the change in weight and balance was non-negligible, and there's an official definition of what a negligible weight and balance change is. And I'm trying to remember, but for aircraft with it depends on the gross weight of the aircraft, but I think for aircraft with a gross weight under about 6,000 pounds, or maybe it's actually higher than that, I think. But for most of our aircraft, a change in weight of 1 pound or less is considered negligible, and then there's actually a change in CG, amount of change in CG that below which it's negligible, and that one I don't remember right off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. There is a FAA advisory circular called the Weight and Balance Manual, which goes into all of this stuff, and it does define what weight and balance changes are considered negligible and which are not.
Okay, and what about the logbook entry?
There we go. The logbook entry is required.
Okay.
You see the reg there? It says, if it's removed from the aircraft, the cockpit control has to be placarded in the maintenance recorded in accordance with 43.9 of this chapter. So if it's
Got it.
removed, you do need a logbook entry.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, Roland is wondering, what about an inoperative fuel pressure gauge in a 1966 Piper? Would that be legal to fly?
I don't have a clue. A fuel pressure gauge obviously is not required by 91205. You'd have to look at the aircraft's equipment list and see if it was required equipment. And I honestly don't know the answer as to whether it is or not. You have to look it up in the equipment list.
Okay, Blake asks, would an unfunctioning magneto be allowed? Or is that a necessary item to have in order to maintain flight-worthy condition?
I'm certain that a non-functioning magneto would not be allowable. The two magnetos are absolutely required equipment under the certification regs.
Gotcha. Tim wonders, Mike, where can I find an equipment list description for my legacy Cessna 172? The POH is more like a fancy sales brochure and doesn't offer anything by way of equipment description.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And when that airplane was delivered from Cessna, it came with an equipment list specific to that particular serial number airplane. And given that model year, it was probably in the form of a fan-folded computer printout, just like the one that came with my airplane. If that equipment list has been lost, you can go to Cessna and give them your serial number, and they will generate a new equipment list for you. I think they charge a fee for that. I don't remember what it is. But if you've lost the equipment list for your Cessna, you can go back to Cessna, give them your specific serial number aircraft, and they will generate a new equipment list for you. Now, of course, the equipment list that they generate for you will be an equipment list as the airplane was delivered from the factory. So if you have subsequently made changes to avionics and stuff, or added, STCs and stuff, you may have to update that equipment list for the changes that have been made. But at least you can get the original equipment list from the manufacturer, and that original equipment list will state what equipment was required equipment and what equipment was optional equipment.
Okay, excellent. Greg asks, does an inop altitude encoder have to be removed or just unplugged?
Well, it certainly doesn't have to be removed. It just has to be disabled. And depending on how the thing is set up, disabling it might be as simple as pulling a breaker. But if it shares a breaker with other equipment that you don't want to disable, then you may have to unplug it at the encoder end. If you can do it by pulling a breaker, it's something that you as the pilot can do. If you have to go and unplug it, that's probably something that a mechanic would be required to do to make it strictly legal.
Ken's wondering, how long may a deferred maintenance item remain deferred? Does it have to be fixed during the next annual or scheduled inspection?
That is a great question, and the answer is no. It can continue to be deferred indefinitely. A lot of IAs don't understand that, and some IAs will tell an aircraft owner that it has to be fixed, but in fact it doesn't. If an item is allowed to be if the aircraft's allowed to be operated with inoperative equipment, then that equipment may remain inoperative indefinitely. Now, if the owner wants to keep the equipment inoperative and not get it fixed, then at annual time the IA is required to document that the equipment is inoperative, and give a list of the inoperative equipment to the aircraft owner that becomes part of the aircraft maintenance records so long as the equipment remains inoperative. So the IA has to make note of this, but it is not the case that the inoperative equipment has to be fixed in order for the airplane to have the annual signed off as airworthy. If 91-213 allows the equipment to be inoperative, it can stay inoperative as long as the owner wants it to stay inoperative.
Gotcha. Okay, Richard asks, what about an exhaust leak? Is it permissible to fly to your A&P if you put a note on the heating system?
Well, I'm not sure what kind of exhaust leak we're talking about. If you're talking about that you're getting some CO in the cockpit, there's no regulation that bears on that, and so you could fly the airplane as long as you do whatever is required to make sure it's not a hazard. You know, the bottom line of 91-213 is that even if you jump through all of the other hoops, the last hoop you have to jump through is to make a determination that the problem does not constitute a hazard. And the reg is written that way so that if you do something stupid, the FAA has a club to beat you over the head with. If it's an exhaust leak, you know, where we're talking about uncontained exhaust that could potentially be a fire hazard, then that's a whole other kettle of fish. So exhaust leaks cover an awful lot of possibilities, and some of them I think would be ones that would be okay to fly with, and some of them wouldn't. And this is purely a hazard determination. It really doesn't have anything to do with, you know, subparagraph 2 or subparagraph 3. It's really that no matter what the other stuff says, if the problem represents a hazard, then you're not supposed to fly that way. It's a pretty common sense requirement.
Holm asks, what about structural damage? For example, aluminum aircraft. How big a dent is tolerable? How about a rip in fabric-covered aircraft, cracked fiberglass, etc.? Airframe stuff.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing where it would be very hard for somebody who is not an A&P to make a determination. I really think that the FAA would consider that a determination of whether it's safe to fly with structural damage is above a non-mechanic's pay grade. So in a situation like that, I think the only really prudent thing to do is to ask an A&P to take a look at it. You know, that subparagraph 4 says that the determination that the condition does not represent a hazard can be made by either the pilot or by a mechanic. That's longer-winded than that. It says somebody who is certificated to perform maintenance on the aircraft, which basically means a mechanic. And it's really up to the pilot to decide whether something is within his capacity to make that determination on, or whether it's something that really requires a mechanic to look at. Structural damage is something that I think any reasonable person would conclude that it requires a mechanic to look at it.
Robert asks, how about when something breaks in flight? For instance, a bug gets into your pitot tube and the airspeed goes to 0. With a GPS on board to show ground speed, do you have to land as soon as possible, or can you cover the gauge and continue to your destination?
Well, That's an interesting question. And this gets back to 91.7, and it says the pilot in command is responsible for determining whether that aircraft is in condition for safe flight. The pilot in command shall discontinue the flight when unairworthy mechanical, electrical, or structural conditions occur. The failure of an airspeed indicator clearly is an unairworthy condition because the airspeed indicator is required by 91.205 for both VFR and IFR. But this reg, it says the pilot in command shall discontinue the flight. It doesn't go so far as to say land as soon as practicable or at the the first suitable airport or anything. So there's a little wiggle room in the reg. Again, sort of the bottom line is if you continue the flight with that inoperative equipment that renders the aircraft unairworthy, and you get into trouble, they're going to hang you because it was your decision that it didn't represent a hazard, and it obviously did represent a hazard if you get in trouble. Again, the reg says that you shall discontinue the flight when unairworthy conditions occur. It doesn't really give you a deadline for doing that, so there is a little bit of wiggle room there, but I wouldn't push it. I've seen cases where a pilot, the oil pressure decreases and gets down into the yellow, and the pilot decides to continue to his destination and trashes the engine, and nobody's going to have very much sympathy for him when that happens. So common sense says you should be kind of conservative about it, but the regs do give you a fair amount of wiggle room there.
Okay, Rich is wondering, do all of these regulations for minimum equipment apply if the aircraft is operated under an FAA special flight permit, a ferry permit?
They absolutely don't apply. There's a specific exclusion in 91.213 that I didn't put on the slide, but it explicitly says that if the operation is on a ferry permit, then instruments and equipment may be inoperative, and you don't have to jump through any of these hoops. Now, to apply for a ferry permit, you have to fill out the application form, which is an 8130-6 form. And one of the things that you have to fill out in that application is to describe the ways in which the aircraft is unairworthy. And then the FAA inspector at the FSDO will look at that form and determine whether he thinks it's okay to fly with those unairworthy conditions, and he may have a chat with you about it. He may have a chat with your mechanic about it. But basically, you can fly with almost anything broken on an airplane if you get a ferry permit. The more broken it is, the more difficulty it may be to get the FSDO guide to approve the ferry permit. But if you have the ferry permit, then you're always allowed to fly the airplane no matter what's broken.
Okay, David asks, for VFR flight, is there a requirement that nav, COM, or GPS databases be current and updated?
For VFR flight?
Yes.
No, there's no requirement. I mean, when you're flying, you're supposed to be relying on current information, but you can certainly, if you have a current sectional, I think that pretty much covers it. There's certainly nothing that says that the GPS database has to be up to date. On the other hand, if you're flying an IFR GPS approach, then it definitely has to be up to date, because then it's providing your primary guidance.
Gotcha.
I mean, it's
Okay.
perfectly legal to, you know, to go up in the sectional chart and turn off all the radios in the airplane, and fly by with your sectional and by dead reckoning or with by looking out the window, and that's perfectly legal. There's no requirement to use any electronic navigation.
Okay. Roger says, the Citabria I rent frequently has loose fairing screws. I just tighten them up and go flying. Should I have a mechanic do this instead?
No, it's well, tightening up loose fairing screws is something that a pilot who is the aircraft owner is allowed to do. If you're a pilot who's a renter, technically you're not supposed to do it. That's just the way the reg is written. But if I were in your shoes, I'd just tighten the screws and go flying.
Okay, and Eric just gives a little tip here about finding leaky cabin seals. He said you can use a smoke machine with a small fan to pressurize the cabin, and then go around and check for the smoke on the outside of the perimeter of the doors or the windows.
Right. That's sort of a trick we use on pressurized airplanes. We will pressurize the cabin with a pressurization cart and have somebody smoke a big stogie inside. And if we see smoke coming out somewhere, we know we found the leak.
Doesn't that leave a residual smell, though?
It probably does. You can also use an ultrasonic thing. We now have things where you put an ultrasonic generator in the cabin, and then you've got an ultrasonic sniffer that you run around outside to find where the sound's coming out. So there's all sorts of ways to do that.
Okay, Lucas asked, what about the 2-year transponder check? If we fly in airspace that doesn't require a transponder, and the transponder hasn't been checked within 2 years, is it okay?
It's okay as long as the transponder is turned off. If you read the reg, it basically says no one may operate a transponder unless within the preceding 24 calendar months the certification has been done. So if the transponder is out of certs, you're not allowed to turn it on. You can fly any place that you're allowed to fly without a transponder. You can fly any place even that requires a transponder if you call ATC and get a waiver. What you can't do is turn the transponder on until the cert gets done.
Okay. And James still has a Loran in the panel of his airplane, and it's not marked inoperative.
I thought they'd shut down all those Loran stations, ground stations, didn't they?
Well, I think that's what he's saying. He's saying that they shut it down. But is he okay under paragraph A to have it in the panel?
Well, sure. First of all, he didn't say whether it was an operative or not. I suppose it could be perfectly operative, but without ground stations, it's not very much use. But certainly he can just put a placard on it that says inop and leave it in the panel. On the other hand, maybe you want to save a pound and take it out and make a logbook entry. And if it's a tray mounting Loran, then the owner can do that and make the logbook entry. He doesn't even need a mechanic to do it. Most likely the Loran is light enough that a weight and balance doesn't have to be redone. Although that would be worth checking with the mechanic to make sure that the weight changes, the weight and balance change is negligible.
Okay. Michelle asks, please discuss whether an inop or intermittent electrical stall warning horn classifies an aircraft as too broken to fly. Most Google discussion boards and A&P said okay to fly, but GA Planes equipment list shows stall warning horn as A, required.
I would weigh in on Plan B there. I think the stall warner is required, and I don't think that it's legal to fly with an inoperative stall warner. other than on a ferry permit or something.
Yep. Okay, Donald asks, on an MEL airplane, if STC added equipment is in-op, do you need an FAA approved MEL with that exempt?
Yeah, if STC equipment is added to the airplane, then that equipment should be addressed by the equipment list. And if it's not addressed by the equipment list, and it's inoperative, then you're not allowed to fly. Even a bad cigar lighter, needs to be addressed by the equipment list. Otherwise you're not allowed to fly with it.
Okay, Alan's wondering, are panel lights required for night VFR?
I don't know the answer to that.
It's a test of 91205 night VFR if panel lights are one of the required items on there.
Yeah, or possibly 209, which addresses lighting. I don't know the answer to that. We have to look it up. I've got a lot of these regs memorized, but not all of them.
Nobody has them all memorized.
Occasionally you have to look them up.
That's even why the examiner lets us have an open book when we take practical tests, if we can find it quick.
Yeah.
Okay, Steve wonders, what is the minimum equipment needed to fly IFR? Can it be done with GPS only, or are VORs still required?
To the best of my knowledge, VORs have never been required, and the reg says that you will have navigation equipment appropriate to the the method of navigation employed. So there was a time when you needed a VOR to back up GPS in order to fly a GPS approach. I'm pretty sure that doesn't apply anymore. So I think it's perfectly legal nowadays to fly an IFR flight with GPS only and not even have working VORs.
Okay, Jim's wondering, magnetic compass cannot so far be corrected due to the high magnetism of the TIG welded airframe.
Yikes.
Yeah, I've given up on trying to find a way to demagnetize. Magnetic compass, not that necessary these days with the VFR, for VFR with GPS. What can be a substitute and be legal?
I think you need to either demagnetize the airframe or find a location for the compass where you're able to compensate it. I don't think that there's any way of getting around the requirement for a magnetic compass.
Okay, Roger says, if a PA-28 loses its alternator in flight, must the pilot land the plane at the nearest airport, or can he proceed to the destination hundreds of miles away?
Well, we talked about that. That was the same as the previous question, and the reg says that the PIC is required to discontinue the flight, but it doesn't give any specific guidance about how quickly. It doesn't say immediately. It doesn't say at the nearest suitable airport. So I think there's some wiggle room in the reg.
Okay. Kenneth wonders, is a non-TSO'd radio legal in a non-electrical aircraft when operated off of a battery?
Is this a certificated aircraft?
He doesn't indicate if it's TC'd or if it's experimental. It didn't say. If it's experimental, certainly he could use a non-TSO'd radio for sure.
If it's,
I guess we'd assume it's maybe a standard aircraft.
Right. If it's a standard category aircraft, there isn't any requirement for the radio to be TSO'd, but there is a requirement that equipment that is sold for installation in a certificated aircraft either needs to have a PMA or a TSO, and if it doesn't have one of those things, then you need a field approval for it. But there are certainly lots of non-TSO'd radios flying around in certificated aircraft.
All right. Good question here. Tom asks, how is an owner-operator supposed to determine the airworthiness of an aircraft by checking logbooks and the AD compliance sheet as required by the FARs when he has no knowledge of the applicable ADs, other than what he might find on the FAA's website, which aren't always up to date?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. It is really not specifically addressed in the FARs. My take on it has been that the FAA does not expect a pilot in command to make technical airworthiness determinations on the aircraft if the aircraft is inannual. And there are no obviously unsafe things that can be determined, during pre-flight. Then I think that's all the FAA expects of a pilot, a non-owner pilot. If the pilot is the owner of the aircraft, he has more responsibilities, and in particular, he has responsibility for making sure the aircraft complies with all applicable airworthiness directives. In most cases, it's sufficient to have all the ADs checked once a year at annual, but occasionally there'll be an AD that has a short compliance time. There are even emergency ADs that have to be complied with before further flight. The FAA used to notify aircraft owners of these things by sending out a snail mail. Nowadays they don't do that, but they provide email notifications to aircraft owners, and to get that you need to go on the I think it's the FAAsafety.gov website and register your aircraft, and then you'll receive email notifications of applicable or potentially applicable ADs. The requirement to comply with ADs is one that's placed on the aircraft owner, not on the pilot in command. It doesn't say so anywhere in writing, but I don't think that the FAA expects non-owner pilots to make technical airworthiness determinations of an aircraft. I think if you verify that the airplane is inannual and it doesn't have anything obviously unsafe about it during the pre-flight, I think that's all that can be reasonably expected of a non-owner pilot. But again, it's not written down anywhere. It's just a matter of what burden is reasonable to place on a pilot who doesn't own the airplane and is not a mechanic.
Okay, we got a comment here from Paul Schuck, who has presented webinars for the EAA webinar series in the past, primarily on light sport aircraft. Paul's got a webinar coming up here on February 12th on LSA documentation and talking about what's in your logbook and checking out a lot of this stuff. So for those of you listening that are wondering about special light sport aircraft and got questions about that category of aircraft, make sure you tune in on February 12th to Paul Shuck's webinar on LSA documentation and ask your questions there.
That
Paul
sounds
does
like
make
one I need to attend.
that would be a yeah. You know, it gets so complicated between standard category, experimental aircraft, now the new special light sport aircraft, and you know, each one is very technical and detailed in itself. So it's hard to really cover all of them all at one time. It just is so overwhelming sometimes. But Paul makes a nice comment about Rotax engines. He says Rotax does have specific guidance as to the size of shavings that you would find on the magnetic drain plug for a Rotax engine, getting back to the, you know, if your engine's making metal. So Rotax has specific guidance too as to when you know, an amount of metal is unsafe to fly.
Right, and I say good for Rotax. As I said, Lycoming does this, Continental doesn't. And if a manufacturer doesn't provide this guidance, then the burden falls on the A&P, and A&Ps are not nearly as good position to make a good decision in this area as the engine manufacturer is. And so generally, when mechanics don't have good guidance from the manufacturer and the responsibility falls on them, they tend to do the ultra conservative thing and say we need to tear down the engine. So you know, I'm glad to hear that Rotax provides that sort of guidance. It's been extremely useful that Lycoming has provided that kind of guidance, and it's very unfortunate that Continental doesn't. when we encounter a situation with Continental engines where we find that the engine is making metal, we try to persuade the applicable IA to use the Lycoming guidance in absence of any guidance from Continental, on the basis that some guidance is better than no guidance, and Continental and Lycoming engines basically use the same metallurgy and the same basic design and so on. But I think all manufacturers should provide guidance like that, because they're in a much better position to do it than leaving the burden on the A&Ps in the field to make a determination as to what's safe and what isn't.
Okay, Andrew asks, can a pilot replace an in-op slide-in piece of avionics, for example, a comm radio, with an exact same model that has been inspected by an avionics shop and found operable?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, Mark, I like short answers.
Right.
Easy.
You don't get many from me, but that one was easy.
Although it does put pressure on me to find another question then to ask right away. So, good question and answer session tonight, Mike and folks. Indeed. I hope you're all getting a lot out of this. Okay, so Mark wonders, if approved aircraft repair or maintenance is done by the owner, how should the logbook notation be entered and signed? Social Security number? Pilot number? What?
Oh, well, it's very simple. I assume that this means something that the aircraft owner is allowed to do under his preventive maintenance authority under Part 43, Appendix A sub C, which technically isn't called a repair. It's called preventive maintenance. But when an owner pilot does any sort of work on his aircraft, he has to log it exactly the same way as an A&P mechanic does. The same rules apply. FAR 43.9 is what says what has to be in the logbook entry. And one of the things that 43.9 requires is that the entry be signed off with a signature, certificate number, and certificate type. And so if it's the owner pilot who's doing this, he signs it off with his pilot certificate number, and what type of certificate it is, a commercial pilot. You know, for many of those certificates, the Social Security number is the certificate number. For some, it's not. But whatever your pilot certificate number is, you would sign it off with that number, and private pilot or commercial pilot or whatever it is, in the same way that I would sign it off with my mechanic certificate number and A&P.
Okay, Daryl, just wondering if you are unable to find a list of equipment in the AFM or POH, is it safe to assume that the aircraft doesn't have one?
It's not safe to assume that. Literally all certificated aircraft, other than antiques.
Something like an Aranca Champ. What about an Aranca Champ?
Well, I'm pretty sure an Aranca Champ would have come with some kind of equipment list. The form of that list has changed over the years, but CAR3, which I'm pretty sure is the approval basis for the Aranca, required an equipment list be provided by the manufacturer and then kept up to date by the owner as equipment changed. Whether it's possible to reconstruct that list if it got lost, I don't know. As I said, in the case of Cessna, I know that it's possible. You call Cessna, give them a serial number and a credit card number, and you get an equipment list from them. In the case of an Aranca, I don't know.
That's where type clubs would be helpful, where you could make an inquiry through the type club, perhaps, or maybe
might very well be.
The Vintage Aircraft Association here at EAA might have information like that, even.
Right.
Okay.
But the Aranca does anybody own that type certificate anymore?
American Champion. Yeah, they actually still make.
I would think
they make
that
them on the
American
same type certificate today. Yeah.
I would guess that American Champion would have the ability to provide an equipment list. I don't know that for a fact because I've never dealt with them. But that would certainly be the first place to go to try to get to see if they can reconstruct the equipment list for that airplane.
Okay, Tom's wondering on the transponder with an inoperative encoder. Can't you just select the on function instead of ALT? Well,
you can, of course, but the question is, what does 91213 require? And 91213 requires that if the equipment is inoperative, it needs to either be removed or it needs to be disabled and placarded. Placarding is easy. You write a Post-it note. Disabling, it depends on the situation. Maybe you can just pull a breaker, or maybe you have to get a plug disconnected. That's what 91213 requires.
Good. Okay. You know where a person could buy a smoke generator?
No,
I guess,
not offhand.
I guess maybe they're trying to check those door seals.
You mean something other than somebody smoking a cigar?
Other than somebody smoking a cigar, yeah, I think that's what they mean. Okay, question on number of attendees tonight. We had, I looked at my counter here, and we had over 500.
Wow.
Low 500s actually in attendance, so a good seminar tonight.
That is.
Number of comments, very informative. Look forward to the next one.
One of these days we're going to get in trouble and get up to that 1,000 limit.
It would be interesting to see what happens. Attendees, we are limited
to
1,000.
All of our computers will blow up.
Oh gosh, that's well. Let's try it, attendees. Hey, everybody, get a friend to log in. So if we had 500 tonight, if everybody recruits one friend to log in, that means we're going to hit that 1,000 mark. Let's see what we can do.
We need a denial of service attack on the webinar.
Well, let's just hope it all works fine. But our counter says 1,000, and it's pegged at 1,000. So That's what I would hope would happen. That would be my expectation of
My
the...
guess is that if we ever did that, Citrix would send you an email saying, "Would you like to upgrade to our 5,000?"
Yeah. Okay, so let's see here. Mark's wondering, does the 2-year transponder certification also apply to experimental airplanes? Answer would be yes on that one. Yes. Okay, Mark also says, I sometimes operate with the rear seats removed. Is this legal?
Well, again, I will assume that this is just certificated aircraft. And the answer is, and it's a little bit complicated. The Part 43 Appendix A sub C, which is what says what maintenance, what preventive maintenance an owner is allowed to do, specifically says that an owner is allowed to remove and reinstall seats. So the act of installing and removing the seats is legal for an owner to do without an A&P involvement. The tricky part is that that Part 43 Appendix A sub C does not permit an aircraft owner to prepare a weight and balance for the aircraft. And removing the seats almost certainly is a non-negligible change in weight and balance. So the way to do that, if you want to be strictly legal about it, is to go to an A&P and get him to prepare 2 weight and balance documents. One with the rear seats installed and one with the rear seats removed. And label those weight and balance A and weight and balance B. Once you have those 2 weight and balance documents, the owner can then remove and install seats, and technically he should make a logbook entry saying, you know, I removed the seats and weight and balance B is now in effect, or I installed the seats and weight and balance A is now in effect. That's the official FAA blessed answer to that particular issue.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay, Mike's wondering, does a panel-mounted VOR receiver require a 30-day accuracy test if it is not being used for IFR navigation?
No. There's another short answer.
Well, that's great. Just a little comment here from Roy. Roy said that smoke from smoke generators can be very corrosive. I would strongly discourage using them inside an aircraft, so throw that out there. Roy,
Yeah.
Thanks, Roy.
I think the ultrasonic thing is the best way to go.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Well, we've gotten to the end of the questions here for the most part. It was an excellent session. Looks like we're butted up against the end of our time here too. I got 9:30 on my clock. So,
Okay.
Mike, would you like to make any last comments here to the attendees?
Okay. Well, very quickly, I want to list the next few first Wednesday of the month webinars. The February one is called How to Flunk an Annual Inspection, and it talks about having annual signed off as unairworthy with discrepancies, and what the regs are with respect to that, and why an aircraft owner might want to have an annual signed off as unairworthy. It's kind of an interesting subject. The March, pardon me for the background noise here. Somebody let a dog into the room here. The March one is on the subject of how to diagnose high oil consumption. This is a problem that is one of the problems that we get a lot of, and we'll talk about what a good systematic way of going through and diagnosing and curing high oil consumption in piston engines. In April, we'll talk about plane bearings, the kind of bearings that are used in our aircraft engine, the main bearings and rod bearings and so on, which is an interesting subject. And finally, in May, I'm going to be talking about something that I call owner in command, which is talking about what responsibilities aircraft owners have with respect to maintenance and how they should act to remain in control of the maintenance of the aircraft. One more thing. I understand that when you close this webinar and go to the survey, Charlie has added a little checkbox to allow participants to sign up for my monthly newsletter, which I send to my clients. We send it to about 3,000 people, and we thought it might be interesting to some of the webinar participants if you'd like to subscribe to the monthly newsletter. It comes out about the middle of each month, so if you'd like to do that, check the checkbox in the survey, and your email address will be added to our list to receive my monthly newsletter going forward. And that's about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for being with us tonight and talking to us about issues of broken aircraft and what we need to do to make sure we're complying with the regs if we fly an aircraft that might have a maintenance issue. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mike. And to all the attendees tonight, thank you so much for tuning in.